Good morning. This is Jeff Pomerance with Jason Balitzer, and we're here in connection with a webinar today, The Life Cycle of Business Opportunity Part 3. First and foremost, welcome. This presentation is the third in a three-part series which tracks the life of a business opportunity from its initial conception as an idea to its ultimate fruition as a successful enterprise. It is not a series of specific recommendations, but rather a discussion about the general principles which tend to guide successful enterprises. Our experience has taught us that if you approach your or your client's next business opportunity with this framework in mind, it will help you to ask the right questions at the right time so that the opportunity may have the best chance of success. Last year, we discussed pre-formation and formation issues. We asked you to put on your thinking cap and recognize that by answering certain questions then, you'll be in the best position to plot out your journey and reach your goals now. Today we're going to talk about the final leg of that journey, both the growth, development, maturation of the business, and finally, the evolution and exit strategies. One important note to consider from the outset, and that's something we've stressed in the prior two presentations, and that's appreciation of the process. As we mentioned in the earlier webinars, it's important to have a recognition of the various stages of the business life cycle, from pre-formation to formation to growth, development, maturation to evolution and exit, and appreciation of the process. For example, an entrepreneur with an amazing idea, we call them Pied Pipers, let's say, who can see opportunities in technologies and various goods and services that are both needed and monetizable or profitable, who has the passion for creation, may be a great CEO at the early formation of the company, but may turn out to be the absolute wrong person to run a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Appreciation of the process helps to identify important opportunities and to continue growth and development. Okay, so let's kick off with our first slide. One of the first things we're going to address today is the business cycle as it relates to the growth, development, and maturation of the business phase. One of the most important things to consider from the outset is stick to the plan. All that work that you put into making the business plan a meaningful and successful starting point to developing your business, all that work that went in has to count. Make it count. Trust the process and trust what you did in getting to this point. Another aspect to consider is measuring performance. I know this seems kind of obvious, but too often it's actually overlooked. Measuring performance is a key component to charting your business's growth. That entails a number of aspects in terms of measuring performance. First is have an effective accounting system. You need to have numbers and information that management can rely upon in making informed decisions. And it starts with your accounting system. The next part of this process, measuring performance, is understand your clients, your customers, and your employees. While it seems obvious, too often businesses look to outsiders to help them gauge information about their clients and customers. We are, and see quite often, consultants used in a variety of formats. And while there's certainly a need at times, it's important to recognize that you as an entrepreneur should know your customer and clients better than anyone else. But also know your employees, know what they bring to the table, what they provide, and what they can do to help you in your efforts. Also, part of this process of measuring performance is evaluating the industry that you're in. I'm reminded, I'm not sure, Jason's too young for this, but I'm reminded of a really good company and a really good product called Smith Corona, the Smith Corona typewriter. That was wonderful in its day, but certainly if you're in a market where technology is making you obsolete, you need to evaluate and measure your performance against that market to understand how best to move forward. In fact, I've been to a recent seminar where retailers and large mall owners are really rethinking their industry in light of the changing buyer habits that we see from people walking in with their smartphones and looking at purchasing online, even though they formerly did this in the brick and mortar context. So understand and evaluate your industry. Once you've looked at that and measured performance, or come up with a means of measuring performance, then you need to take the next step, and that's you need to evaluate it. You have to take those measurements and assess your performance. And again, while these things seem obvious, it's important to note that it really needs to be carefully built into your operations to make sure that you have a means of measuring performance and then evaluating that performance against what you believe is reasonable, appropriate, and that should be reflected in your business plan. Let's talk for a moment about planning for the future. Planning is an imperative as it helps you to address how to effectively manage your business as it matures. Planning does not equal a guarantee of success. In fact, it can be, it can be frustrating and at times trying in that your best, as the poet once noted, the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. But it's nonetheless important and useful in helping management maximize the chance for success. Today we've decided to kind of break down planning for the future into 5 kind of general concepts. There are many more that management can add in its planning process. The planning components that we'd like to at least touch on briefly are the following: capital improvements, additional funding, business expansion, strategic acquisitions, and succession planning. Okay, capital improvements. We refer to it as CapEx. Often it's related to investment in infrastructure. What will your business need in the way of investment in capital fixed assets as it develops? Considerations of location, facility size, equipment are just some of the needs that businesses, as they mature and develop, need to give consideration to as they're making decisions and moving forward. And these amounts often are significant. And in fact, in some ways, they may be shaped by the type of lending or financial structure involved. So capital improvements is one area. When you're talking about planning for the future, you've got to give careful consideration to what the capital improvements needs are for your company. Along those lines, the concept of additional funding. Your company right now is operational. You're generating cash, profits, hopefully, presumably, but notwithstanding that, sometimes there's a need for additional financing, additional funding. Why is that? Because perhaps you have CapEx needs, capital improvement needs. Maybe you need other funds for business expansion and development. The type of financing, the cost of capital, and other considerations can and generally will significantly affect the development of your business. And again, this is something that needs to be planned for and constantly monitored. Another area of planning is related to business expansion in general. This ties into both the capital improvements and additional funding we just discussed. As a business matures, what does this mean? What is required? So often, and I've seen this in early stage companies that we work with, that the best thing that happens to a company is they get a major contract, but now they have to expand rapidly to meet the needs of that contract. And while you can't always anticipate those, in the planning for your business, you should be at least thinking about how your company may need to expand and how it can expand. Another area to consider is strategic acquisitions. It's so important, and you've presumably done this in your business plan, know who is in your space and how a strategic alliance can enhance the market share or your company's performance. That can be done through both vertical and horizontal integration. This tends to be a very successful means of business expansion, and the deal makes sense.
And Jeff, could you touch on for a moment the difference between vertical and horizontal integration?
Well, excellent question. And it really relates to whether you want to be a full service provider or whether you simply want to, and again, it depends on the product or services, but whether you want to take your company's business or service and expand it so that it runs the breadth of a need, let's say, as opposed to grabbing the parts along the way, if you will, that come into the product or service you're providing. Again, that's something we could spend, a whole webinar on. But the concept of strategic acquisitions, Jason, and the idea that you have strategic alliances, for instance, a lot of times one of the ways to develop your business is by working with a marketing or business development group, as opposed to trying to do it yourself, and using them to help you reach new markets and market opportunities. One of the last things, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later, is succession planning. It's important to note, at least at this point, that this planning and the planning for the future, succession planning, you might think, well, that relates to when the company is fully matured or at a certain stage or development, and the answer is no. You should be thinking about succession planning from the formation of your business. And we discussed that in the formation stage as it relates to deal structure and sometimes why you'd want to set up a corporation or a C corporation as opposed to a limited liability company. So the concept of succession planning is all part of the planning process that you're planning for the future. Okay, next slide touches on we've been focused on a business as it's growing and developing, and so sometimes, whether it be a short-term issue or a significant challenge, a company runs into difficulties. They can occur, as I've just mentioned, both in good and bad contexts. A good context is that your company is expanding rapidly, but at that moment you're a cash flow crunch. Of course, there can be problems where your company is not profitable or losing money, but regardless, I think it's important as we talk about planning to at least understand that difficulties may arise, and you need to manage those difficulties to continue to grow and expand your business and the values that you're trying to create. Again, sometimes they're short-term, sometimes they're long-term. But regardless, when problems arise, we found that management really needs to give consideration to the following. Number one, cash flow management. I can't stress enough how important it is that management know how to effectively manage cash. In the rah-rah days of the 90s and very early 2000s, companies didn't really need to worry about this because they felt, especially venture-backed companies, that if they need more money, they would just go back to the venture group or the financier and just get more money. That has changed. And I know of a number of opportunities where the company has been advised by its financier that they need to build a business that can withstand a certain period of time without going back for additional financing. So it's absolutely imperative that regardless of whether you're going through difficulties or not, although right now we're focusing on difficult moments, that management pay careful consideration to cash flow. Along those lines, one of the things that I think sometimes doesn't get addressed significantly or sufficiently is retention of qualified management. I know in my days at Digital Media Campus, when we were looking at investing in companies, one of the things that we looked at was the management team. And not just their ability to manage cash, but their ability to execute, their ability to handle challenges, their vision, and their understanding of market forces and how they can drive value. Retention of qualified management, keeping your team together is a challenge and something that every company, especially in difficult times, should really focus on. We touched on it earlier, but again, additional funding sources and potentially, if there's a more systemic problem or issue, restructuring. Sometimes difficulties arise because of the capital structure. The company's too laden with debt, The equity has a certain desire to get out of the investment within a set period of time, which may not be conducive to the business growth of the company. So understanding your financing sources and your capital structure and where you might need to go to get additional funding is something that every management team should be focusing on. The next point to raise, highlight in the deck, is incentive programs. Clients and customer incentive programs, employee incentive programs. What we're really talking about here is how to retain, we talked about management earlier, but how to retain the valuable components in your business success, your clients and your customers, and of course the employees that are providing the service that are helping you drive value. Companies need to constantly be thinking about how to incentivize their product or service to their clients and customers. And lastly, continuing what we discussed in planning, strategic initiatives. It's very, very important that a company constantly continue to monitor its environment, develop relationships, understand who's in its space, and understand how a strategic alliance may help drive value and either help a company work through a difficult time or help a company improve on its performance. And that generally involves, the concept of strategic initiatives, which is understanding your market and understanding how you can work with others to enhance value. Along the lines of difficulties, kind of touching on one other subject in our next slide, is this concept of change and the need for change. We talked about growth and maturity of a business. So the question is, if the company is growing and it's developing, why are we discussing change? Well, without a crystal ball or clairvoyance, I think one should actually, even when things are going well, one should anticipate that your company, its success, great business plan, top-notch management, something's going to need to change. And I say this because I think it's important to note that maybe a different way of looking at change and the notion of change. First thing I refer to here is the lobster in its shell. Dr. Abraham Twersky, a noted psychiatrist, mentioned that he read a very interesting piece on lobster and how, as it's growing, it outgrows its shell, and there's discomfort. And that discomfort causes it to leave its shell and find a new shell. And his insight and assessment was that we see from this that sometimes growth can be painful or discomforting and require change. But it's that change that facilitates the growth. And so often, things are going well. Why do we want to cause ourselves additional challenges or for lack of a better term, pain? And the answer is sometimes that pain signifies the need for change, and that change signifies an opportunity for growth. So the second thing to think of and mention here is body surfing the Pacific Ocean. I know when Jason and I have talked to entrepreneurs and clients over the years, one of the things that that they've expressed is the concern about change, the unknown, the challenge that it may entail. How do I handle it? How do I address it? What do I do? Well, part of it is the things we're trying to suggest in this webinar, in this series. But I mentioned the concept of body surfing because once you expect change, and you expect that there is going to be something different from what you've planned, what do you do with that? The example I would suggest is it's like going to the Pacific Ocean and you can't wait to go swimming, you can't wait to go in and enjoy yourself, but you don't like waves. So you want to go in nonetheless. And my suggestion is look at change like a person in that environment would look like body surfing. In other words, understand that it's there, that it's going to be there, recognize it's going to be there, and use it to your benefit. Instead of standing there getting slapped by waves or staying out of the water, get in there and embrace the opportunity and enjoy it. And while we focus on planning and on processes, it's so important you recognize that no matter what you try and accomplish, there is going to be a change in some aspect of your business. And that brings me to the next point, which is the role of your business plan. We talked about in the development of a business plan, part of that is a financial model. The model itself includes certain variables because your business may exceed your expectations, it may not rise to your level of expectations, it may change completely. But what your business plan and the financial model that you've created hopefully helps you do is to guide yourself as to how to address these changes, address these quote-unquote blips in the screen, so you can actually anticipate it, manage it, and then use it to help you chart a proper course to a successful company. Jason, the next thing, and now we start getting to some more specifics, is the concept of planning for transition. And now we're going to focus a little bit on the evolution and exit strategies associated with the life cycle of a business. In many instances, this results from a transition event. Something happened, and that something is significant enough that it rises to the level where a company may need to pivot and examine a new course. This is that change that we discussed on the last slide. This can occur both from good things happening to your company, you get new management, new financing, major contract, you acquire a company or an opportunity. It can also happen as a result of a bad event. For instance, you lose key manager, cash flow crunch, the market adversely affects your business or opportunity, you lose a significant client. So we talk about now planning for transition. So let's be clear that we spoke earlier about planning for the future. What's the distinction between planning for the future and planning for transition? Really, planning for transition is a subset of planning for the future. Your focus now is not on general concepts, but on more specific and generally more identifiable issues. Generally, the timeline is shortened. In fact, things start to come into view in the context of planning for transitions. The plan for a transition requires the recognition of really a more reality into the process. What are we going to do now, in this instance, given these circumstances? So it's important as we talk about transition events and planning for them that we recognize the roles of management, the roles of ownership. It's imperative that you understand and delineate and clearly identify what those roles are. Management's job is to execute on a strategy, to implement the strategy. The owner's job is to provide the structure, the company, the opportunity, and to empower the managers to perform. Sometimes those roles are lockstep. They have the same focus, but sometimes they're not. For example, management may want a short-term fix, additional cash infusion, let's say, to help it through a specific period of time, or to acquire a specific asset or opportunity. But the ownership may look at that as an unnecessary or expensive opportunity that candidly they may feel is not in the best interest of the company. So there can be a dichotomy of interests. I think one of the things to think about in anything we do and why we're engaged in this process is to focus on value. And the value we're talking about is the enterprise value of the company. And value, again, is a subjective concept, but certainly if at least you know that that's your focus, you can then address how to measure it and evaluate decisions based on value. One of the key things here, and we're going to spend more time on transition events, is the recognition that the timing and implementation considerations are very different than general planning. Often, timing tends to be critical. You need to execute on a timely basis, or you'll either miss the opportunity or harm the business. Okay, so Jason, now we're going to talk about, we refer to it here as the last stop in the life cycle. And let me suggest that in many instances, while we're now addressing this last stop and the exit or evolution, the decisions that we're going to discuss, the issues we're going to discuss, don't necessarily mean it's the last stop in your business. In some instances, the decisions in the proper transition, for instance, the restructuring, can permit the company to get back on track and to continue growth and development. Having said that, we thought we would share with you insights into 5 potential quote-unquote transition events in the life cycle of a business. The first one, the next slide, relates to the concept of what we call a cash cow. Now, what is a cash cow? Cash cow is a wonderful problem, and that is your business is doing well, it's generating cash, it's profitable, and it's continuing to grow. So you may ask, how is this a transition event? Well, sometimes when this occurs, you can fall asleep at the wheel. You simply sit back and let it ride. In other words, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And certainly that's understandable. The reason why we suggested you may want to think of this as a transition event is that sometimes that ride has a definite time period involved. And I think it's important, even if the company is doing well, to recognize that while it's doing well, perhaps it could be done better, perhaps it could be more profitable, perhaps there are opportunities that will enhance it or sustain the success that you've achieved. And again, the reason why we talk about this as a transition event is to really kind of convey to you that you need to constantly manage the process rather than let it manage you. Now, it's important to recognize what we call market and value considerations. You should always be prepared to consider structural considerations to maximize value. For example, in some instances, we've done transactions where a company has created what we call a drop-down subsidiary that then manages a specific division or licenses a specific asset or right, which creates value in and of itself. The example sometimes, crude example, but perhaps an old example given timing, is when Coke decided to come out with a new recipe so they could grab more shelf space. They were already profitable, but they were constantly considering other opportunities, structural considerations, new products, new services, legal, structural, corporate issues to maximize value, continue that cash generation into the future. The next slide talks about the concept of liquidation and dissolution. In most instances, this approach suggests that the business has failed. And that's generally true, but not always. There are instances in which the company simply run its course and there's no meaningful offers, and the ownership decides that they no longer wish to invest their energies and resources in the venture. We refer to this often as closing the doors and turning off the lights. Now, it's important to recognize that there's a statutory process involved. In many jurisdictions, there's a certificate of liquidation. Then there is a management that's empowered to liquidate the business, which means to monetize the assets for the highest value, maximizing value, and then to satisfy the creditor claims before making any distributions to ownership. When that's done, then typically there's a certificate of dissolution. Now this is one exit strategy that has a lot of implications associated with its implementation. When a company, the fact that a company ceases to operate does not mean that the obligations to the creditors cease. In fact, often we find that this approach of liquidation and dissolution is problematic where the liquidation process does not pay all the creditors in full. There's also timing issues. If a business has a certain number of employees and they want to close down operations, they have to comply with what they call the WARN Act, which requires 60 days advance written notice of closure. There are many other considerations. So as I said, it's not as simple as simply closing the doors and turning off the lights. We find, and we found that companies that are really have reached the end of the line and are completely unable to satisfy assets or satisfy their creditors and have no assets, they do take this approach. But again, it's not simple. There are implications, and that doesn't mean that down the road the owners won't get a phone call or a lawsuit. But again, it's one option to consider. The next one, and I'm going to turn this over to Jason, is something that we at SulmeyerKupetz know very, very well and do a lot of, and that is the approach of looking at bankruptcy and solvency. Again, as I mentioned in liquidation dissolution, not every bankruptcy or insolvency is a bad thing. I know that sounds crazy, but Jason will expound upon that. In fact, some of these instances may be an ideal way for you as an entrepreneur or manager to capture and retain value. Jason, why don't you jump in and share with us what a bankruptcy and insolvency means and how this works in this context.
Thanks, Jeff. Simply put, bankruptcy is a process that was created by Congress where an estate is created, which is basically an independent entity into which all of the company, or in this case it would be a debtor's assets, are placed, and that estate is administered by a fiduciary for the benefit of the debtor's creditors. And you're right, it's not always a bad thing. Often, especially in a Chapter 11 context, it enables the company to shed its debts and reorganize and move forward. And all you need to do is, look at any General Motors dealership right now, and that is exactly what's intended to happen in the Chapter 11 context. They restructure, they reorganize their debts, and then they move forward. The bankruptcy process is basically laid out in the United States Code in Title 11, and Title 11 itself is divided into a number of chapters, and I think a lot of people have heard of the phrase Chapter 7 or Chapter 11. Those are all actually chapters in the book, in Title 11. And there are a number of chapters, but the main ones that we're going to concern ourselves with are Chapter 7 and Chapter 11, because those are the ones that generally come into play with businesses. Bankruptcy can be commenced voluntarily or involuntarily. It's commenced the same way in that a petition is filed, but the difference between a voluntary and an involuntary bankruptcy is, in an involuntary bankruptcy, it's actually filed by creditors who want to send the company into bankruptcy because they don't trust management, or they want some independent person to come in and actually administer the estate. And by the way, when I say administer the estate, I really mean monetize it, and that means it can mean selling assets if they can be sold for cash. It can also mean collecting outstanding debts, or initiating causes of action, initiating lawsuits on behalf of the estate, all of which would inure to the benefit of the debtor's creditors, which is different. Outside of a bankruptcy context, it would inure to the benefit of the debtor itself. Most cases, though, are commenced voluntarily. A debtor basically decides, for one reason or another, depending on the circumstances, that a bankruptcy would be the best course of action. And if things are really dire, you might elect Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. There's really no intent to move forward with the business at that point, because Chapter 7 will result in all of the assets being dissipated, but the debts will be gone as well. If, on the other hand, a Chapter 11 is available, and I'll explain a little later why Chapter 11 is it's not as easy to file a Chapter as Chapter 7, but a Chapter 11 can actually enable a company to significantly enhance its value, after the bankruptcy. Let me give you some brief distinctions between Chapter 7 and Chapter 11. Chapter 7, as I said, is a liquidation. And if you actually were to open up a copy of the United States Bankruptcy Code, the title of that chapter is liquidation. You file a bankruptcy, an independent Chapter 7 trustee comes in. This person has no previous relationship with the company, and that person is there for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to take whatever money there is, collect whatever money is outstanding, put it all in one pot, and divvy it up to creditors in accordance with a priority scheme that's laid out by the Bankruptcy Code. And then the Chapter 7 trustee gets paid based on a portion of, it's a percentage sliding scale on how much they distribute. Chapter 11 reorganization, on the other hand, and again, reorganization is the actual title of that chapter. That actually can be used for a number of purposes. But basically, the general concept is the debtor goes in, continues to operate. And in Chapter 7, they don't operate anymore. They say to the Chapter 7 trustee, here are my things, pay my debts, I'm moving on with my life. In Chapter 11, the debtor can operate and often does, and this is called a debtor in possession. Debtor acts as trustee. Debtor continues to operate the business, and the purpose is to come up with what's called a plan of reorganization that can be confirmed by the court. Once it's confirmed, think of it as like a court-approved payment plan, after which the debtor's pre-petition debts are restructured. So when the debtor emerges from bankruptcy, they're in a far better position to continue operations. And again, General Motors is a perfect example, but there have been, think American Airlines. There have been many, many prominent companies who have filed Chapter 11 and thereby increased their value.
Jason, that's an excellent point, in that the Chapter 11, the bankruptcy process, is not necessarily the end of the road. Sometimes it's a pit stop to restructure in a way that you come out
Absolutely
in a better place and better able to perform.
Absolutely. Chapter 11, as I said, also allows the debtor to maintain control of the company, because again, Chapter 7, the purpose is you're in that case you are kind of giving up, and maybe that's the right call. Maybe especially if you have an enterprise and there are several companies that are part of this enterprise, maybe sending that one company into Chapter 7 liquidation and then focusing on your profitable companies, maybe that's the way to go. But to the extent that you can actually help the company survive and thrive through a Chapter 11, that is preferable. And again, you get to maintain control. You get to serve as a debtor in possession. Now, it should be made clear that if you're going to serve as a debtor in possession, your role is different than it was outside of bankruptcy. Outside of bankruptcy, you had a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders or to your members. You're in bankruptcy, your fiduciary obligation is to your creditors. And there are a lot of restrictions and rules that you need to follow. And everything that's done in bankruptcy is out in the open. So one thing that, whether you're filing Chapter 7 or 11, but especially 11 since you're going to be much more involved, you have to be comfortable with the concept that what you are doing is going to be scrutinized. It's a lot of the documents you file are under penalty of perjury. The purpose of bankruptcy is to put a pause on all collection efforts and, basically allow the, through court supervision, the fiduciary, whether it's a trustee or a debtor in possession, to administer assets in a way that is that comports with the bankruptcy code and respects the rights of all creditors. After it's done, many of the debts go away, but the flip side is everything really is out in the open. And so I can't stress this enough. To the extent that management is not used to that, they will need to become comfortable with that aspect. Because again, like so many things are signed under penalty of perjury, and even there are a lot of people that do not like signing things under penalty of perjury, and not because they're liars or there's anything sinister going on. It's just, when we go through life, we don't usually communicate that way, and so that there is some growing pain there. Chapter 11, I've explained how it allows the business to continue. It allows the debtor to maintain control of the company. There is a flip side. It's a lot more expensive, and because you're operating, so first off, you need to have the money to keep the lights on. You really do. You need to be able to pay your utilities. You need to be able to pay your insurance. You need to be able to pay your employees. All the things that you needed to, all the payments you needed to make to keep your business afloat before the bankruptcy, you need to continue to be able to do that. And to the extent that you don't have the money on hand, you need to find financing. And there is a process. It's known colloquially as DIP financing, debtor in possession financing. It's generally as a high-risk loan, so the terms aren't going to be as favorable as you might be used to outside of the bankruptcy context with a profitable company, and the creditor often receives a super priority protection, but at the same time, it might be enough to help you shepherd through the process. So when you're preparing for bankruptcy, and you think about the costs and everything, it really does depend on a number of factors. First off, some bankruptcies are done with a very clear purpose, like we're going to sell this this division or something like that. Some of them, there's an imminent event. All of a sudden you're in violation of your loan documents because of something that's out of your control. Your financial ratios are off, and now you're afraid there's going to be a foreclosure. Depending on the size of the company, so there's no one method fits all, one size fits all way to plan for bankruptcy. But I can give you just a few things to consider. First off, if you are filing for Chapter 7, whether you're filing for Chapter 7 or Chapter 11, really, the first thing you want to do is figure out what your assets are, figure out what your liabilities are, figure out what your potential assets are. That is a big mistake a lot of people make. They think, I have this much cash on hand. If you actually have the ability to sue somebody, that's something you need to disclose as well. If you have some proprietary information, you don't actually need to put it on the docket. If you're Coca-Cola, you don't need to list. You don't actually have to identify the recipe on your schedule so all of us can look at it and learn how to make Sprite. But you do need to disclose that you have this valuable asset. It all needs to be at least the existence of it. Everything is filed under penalty of perjury. You prepare what's called a statement of financial affairs, which lists a number of things. Lists like your who your insiders are, who's done your bookkeeping, what pre-petition transfers have been made, and that becomes important when we talk about avoidance actions. And that's whether you file Chapter 7 or 11, you do all this work up front. But if you file a Chapter 7 case, you file your petition, trustee is appointed, you show up for what's called the 341A meeting of creditors, and sometimes it gets continued, often it doesn't, but basically you sit there and your creditors have an opportunity to examine you, meaning to ask you questions, and then otherwise your job is largely done, because the Chapter 7 trustee is going to be the person that's charged with administering the estate and paying creditors. In Chapter 11, you file the petition and the schedules and the statement of financial affairs, and you show up for 341A, but you also, since you're operating the business, one thing you need to understand, if you're in bankruptcy, everything you're doing that's outside of the ordinary course will require court approval. So you need to file what are called first day motions just for permission to get to pay your utility bills, to pay your employees, to use what's called cash collateral. The financing that I discussed, that financing, it actually needs to be approved by the court. And as a debtor in possession, since everything you're going to do requires some court approval and some oversight, you're going to have money on hand to pay your professionals, because Chapter 11 is not cheap. And to the extent that it involves highly litigious participants, the costs can explode very quickly. On the other hand, to the extent that it goes smoothly, you could find that at the end of it, you shed most of your debts and you can move forward. And we've done a number of those, and businesses are now thriving that 5 years ago.
Capital structures.
Exactly, yeah. So let me actually briefly talk about preference and fraudulent conveyances. One of the things that the trustee or debtor in possession, whoever's in charge of the estate, needs to look at is whether or not there's any money that's not in the estate that should be. And this is actually something that management needs to consider if they're thinking about the bankruptcy route, because often there's this possibility that management, officers, directors, owners have received payments that the bankruptcy fiduciary is bound to unwind. And to the extent that they are acting as debtor in possession, their fiduciary obligation is not to their members anymore, it's to their creditors. They can actually bring a conflict. A preference or a preferential payment is simply a payment that was made during a certain reach-back period. For most people, it's 90 days, but for insiders, like management can often be, it goes back a year, where you received money and other people around you that should have gotten paid were not able to get paid. That's a simplistic way to describe it, but basically Congress decided that it's unfair for all those other creditors who were in your same position to have gotten nothing while you got paid, most or maybe in full. So it's like you have 7 vendors and you like one vendor. There's nothing sinister going on, but you like this vendor because this vendor's been doing business with you for a very long time, and you can only pay one of the 7. So you choose that vendor, and then you file bankruptcy the next day. Well, the bankruptcy code says that the trustee needs to unwind that payment, which basically means collect it from the recipient and then divvy it up in accordance with the bankruptcy code. And the way that the trustee collects it is one of 2 ways. Either it's voluntarily paid back, or a lawsuit is initiated in the bankruptcy code. Now, there are certain defenses that are available. So the one is called the ordinary course of business. Like if you just every month for the last 4 years you've gotten an invoice and you've paid it within 2 weeks from this vendor who's part of your supply stream in your business, then they might be able to say that that was just an ordinary course payment. Also, additionally, if there's something called a new value defense. So even if somebody receives a preferential payment, if they continue to then provide new value, they can get an offset against their liability. But the point is, to the extent that think of like a bonus payment that management pays to themselves. If they do that, and then 6 months later they're thinking about a bankruptcy, they might have preference liability. Similarly, there are fraudulent transfers. And fraudulent it's kind of an unfortunate phrase because some of them involve fraud, but most of them don't involve intent at all. there's basically two kinds, and I'll go this really quickly. Fraudulent, there's actual fraudulent transfers which are made with the intent to defraud a creditor, or not to hinder, delay, or defraud a creditor. Basically, you're trying to hide your assets, make it harder for them to collect. And then there's constructive fraudulent transfers, meaning you dissipated assets and you didn't get reasonably equivalent value in exchange. Again, these sorts of things you need to consider, because as an insider, as management, you might, for example, have maybe you decide to lend some money, and then you realize, and this has actually happened in a case where we had a client, they lent money, and then they were going to file bankruptcy, and they realized, hey, I want to have a security interest in the money I lent. So they recorded a UCC, and there was nothing that was given in exchange at the time. That was avoidable. As far as the outcomes, again, in a Chapter 7, it's a liquidation. The business isn't moving forward, but your debts are gone. With a Chapter 11, on the other hand, you can get rid of a lot of your debts through a plan of reorganization. You can sell assets. You can get refinancing. And then, if the Chapter 11 doesn't work out, it can turn into a Chapter 7, and that happens sometimes. Think Borders books. They wanted to reorganize. They weren't able to. They ultimately sold it to a Chapter 7. They converted to a Chapter 7, and it was liquidated. Now, with respect to certain alternatives to bankruptcy, because bankruptcy is not for everybody, there are other options. For example, you could do a consensual UCC foreclosure. The UCC allows for that, so the secured creditor can just take the assets and get rid of the debt that way. You can have a receivership, which is a state court process. Receiver comes in, administers the company's assets, and then basically turns the company back over. Problem with that is it's expensive. One that we're lucky to have here in California is called the Assignment for the Benefit of Creditors, and that's also known as an ABC. It's kind of like a Chapter 7 in that it's common law liquidation procedure. An assignment is made. It's like a contract, basically, and an independent fiduciary is appointed, and by the contract, all of the assets are transferred to what's called the assignee. That's the independent fiduciary, who then administers the assignment estate much like a Chapter 7 trustee would. They send out claims notices to creditors. They have a claims bar date, and then they pay according to a scheme that's laid out in various sections of the California statutes. It's less costly, and it's not as public as a bankruptcy. But at the same time, in my experience, it's a great alternative. But sometimes people are unfamiliar with it.
Jason, that was excellent, and I think one of the things to note in what Jason had suggested is this is very much a process that requires a professional to understand how to best make it work for you. There are reasons not to do a bankruptcy. There are reasons to do a bankruptcy. We have a few minutes, but I want to touch on a couple more things. This is the sale liquidity event is generally if not the goal, it's the crowning achievement in many instances of a business. Someone looks at your opportunity or your business and wants to buy it. Just as not every bankruptcy is a bad thing, not every sale liquidity event is a good thing, but generally they are good things. In most instances, this is one of the primary goals of a business. This is why you've structured your business, done all this work, undertaken to operate it in a particular way to maximize value, and now someone appreciates that. So what is a sale liquidity event? In very brief terms, it's conversion of your equity into value, whether it be dollars or other consideration. It can take the forms of an acquisition of your company's stock or the equity, as the case may be, or the company's assets. It can be done by a sale, a merger, consolidation. There are a myriad of ways. I've done deals where it's been in the form of a license. The planning considerations, again, you heard before, planning is key. The timing and process, I will tell you that as an M&A attorney, that time is not your friend. You want to move these things along as fast as you can. the negotiating deal considerations. You got to start thinking about negotiating the moment you meet a potential acquirer, assuming they come to you, and certainly to the extent that you want to look for a potential acquirer, the negotiation starts the moment you put pen to paper or pick up the phone. Everything is on the table. Deal considerations, again, are varied, but generally talk to people that work in this area that understand the process. Implementation and completion. Generally, there's a preliminary discussion phase. There's preliminary agreements. There's confidentiality agreements, letters of intent, due diligence checklists. Then there's performance of the due diligence. Then there's drafting and finalizing the principal or definitive documents. Those include a purchase agreement, bill of sale, assignment agreement, terms of employment agreements, transition services agreements, assignment docs, ancillary docs, you name it. Post-closing considerations. Even a closed deal is not a done deal. What I mean by that, sometimes you have post-closing obligations. The deal closed, you got your money, but you still have things to accomplish, whether it's helping in transition, whether it's publicity, you name it. So one of the last things to consider is succession planning. Now, a bankruptcy and a sale event is one form of succession planning, but there are others. Sometimes you can't involve a system, the bankruptcy, and sometimes you don't find a third party that wants to buy your company or its values. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't plan for succession. In fact, you should plan from succession from the moment you've articulated the opportunity that you want to take and build a business around. It's important to at least acknowledge that in part of the planning, you have to recognize that you may need someone else to come and operate and own the business at some point, and it may not be through a sale. You see this often in closely held businesses, family businesses, who will run the business when the founders step back. The timing of succession planning cannot begin early enough. You got to train management effectively, which can lead to a succession plan involving management becoming the ownership. There's an interesting piece, I'll just refer you to it. It was in the Orange County Business Journal by Stephen Tierney of Nenow and Tierney, entitled "To Keep Your Business Successful, Know Who Will Follow You." In this piece, he notes just a couple things. You need to know who will take over and provide for a plan for succession. Otherwise, you're jeopardizing the values you've tried to create, the livelihood of both your employees and your family if it's a family-owned business. And he lays out in there what succession planning really should involve. It should be a writing. It should include a description of the job involved, qualifications, timetables, step-by-step actions, and the procedures to follow in the event of an unexpected need for succession. I've done a number of these, or management buyouts. They're wonderful from the standpoint that you have two parties that are actively involved in the business, the ownership and the management. The management, as it learns and understands the value, recognizes and perceives the value, so you don't have to assert the value, they live it. And it can be done over time. It's not a specific event. So in some ways, by having a really good management team, you can create your own ultimate succession plan. Regardless, you should have estate planning considerations in mind. Don't just rely on a sale liquidity event. Meet with estate planning advisors who will help you structure the ownership in a way that will maximize the value and minimize the tax exposure. One last thing I'll touch on in the role of former owners and managers in value retention. I can't stress this enough, that in many instances, succession planning works because there's a transition plan in place so that the customers, vendors, employees that are critical to the business understand that change is coming, but that change will not result in pain, and in fact, they appreciate it and understand that even though succession planning is really an internal kind of focus, nonetheless, by providing them with kind of a sensitivity and comfort that the business will continue, you can assure that the values will hopefully stay within the business. Legal considerations, again, estate planning, and post-succession planning. As with everything else, planning. A lot of this is handled through estate planning and estate planning advisors. So lastly, we want to get back to the recipe. Some final considerations. We touched on this before, but I'll say it very briefly. The importance of being earnest. Make sure that whatever you do, that no one outworks you in the opportunity through the life cycle of the business. The importance of being earnest to us means do your homework. Constantly be working the process. Management isn't something that is handed to you. It's generally something you go out and through empowerment perform. Part of this is listen and learn. Too often there are things that are signals, and you won't know how to address change if you're not actively engaged in the process through listening and learning. Address facts. Things arise, and too often, sometimes, even though we have come across facts that aren't good, we ignore them. My suggestion is address them and see how you can manage them, i.e. the body surfing example in the Pacific Ocean. One important consideration is intellectual versus emotional, especially in a family-owned business. It's very, very hard because the business takes on the persona of its owners, and it's important to, when you can, and that's perhaps through my next point, the use of professionals, is to understand that you have to sometimes separate the intellectual and emotional components. Lastly, use of professionals. That's why we're here. We understand this process. We've been through it. We've seen all kinds of permutations. And if I may, what I think makes Jason and I unique in this opportunity and why we've so enjoyed this webinar series is that we have a unique viewpoint, because we have worked on clients and businesses all along this life cycle. And in so doing, we've seen mistakes that that are teaching and learning opportunities, and we're excited to bring those to our clients as we help them grow their business. In conclusion, I want to start by first and foremost thanking Burbay and Rekha and Megan of Burbay and marketing. They've done a spectacular job, and we appreciate all their help and assistance. I also want to thank my colleague over here, Jason, who's an exceptional attorney and has having been in this business for a long time, has a very, very unique and special skill set, and it's a joy to work with him. And lastly, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for listening and participating in this process. We love it. We love helping companies all along the process. And we hope that if you ever have any needs or we can be of any service, that you will not hesitate to call us. Thank you again.